January 20th, 2025. A US Border Patrol agent was gunned down on a snowy night near the Canadian border. Just a few weeks later, a sword-wielding attacker brutally slaughtered an 82-year-old man in California. Around the same time, there was a double murder in a well-off, peaceful Philadelphia suburb. What ties these seemingly unrelated acts of violence? Well, that's a group of brilliant computer scientists radicalized by their isolation from mainstream society who grew increasingly extreme in their views about veganism, transgender identity, artificial intelligence, and environmentalism. This is not a story of murder. This is about a fringe cult like nothing you've ever encountered before. The group has it all: radical philosophies, exceptionally bright minds from some of the world's top institutions, family betrayals, faked deaths, sleep deprivation, and so much more. This is the story of the Zizians, a group whose philosophy, originally intended to save the world, unraveled into chaos and bloodshed. A quick note to you guys here. This episode features a large number of transgender individuals, many of whom are in the process of transitioning or questioning their transition. We've made every effort to respect the facts and use preferred names where possible. However, do remember that we are all human and may have made a few mistakes along the way. We apologize ahead of time. The Zizians did not begin as a violent cult. In fact, they didn't even start out with a distinct philosophy. It would take many years of isolation and radicalization for them to reach that point. As with so many cults, to understand their origin, we must first examine their founder and her backstory. Jack Lesota, who would later transition and identify as a woman, was born in 1988 in Fairbanks, Alaska. From an early age, she was fascinated by technology and naturally chose to pursue a degree in computer science at the local University of Alaska Fairbanks. She found success from the start, eventually securing internships with both Oracle and NASA. Despite her strong academic performance, problems began to arise for Lesota. By the time she reached graduate school, she already felt a growing sense of disinterest from the broader programming community and found herself increasingly drawn toward artificial intelligence, specifically to developing safeguards around it. Ultimately, she decided to drop out of grad school. She remains active as a programmer, working on a video game, but spent more and more of her time online discussing the intricacies of artificial intelligence and potential future threats to the world. It was during this period that she first encountered the rationalist community, who were active on numerous blogs, such as Less Wrong, that she would soon become deeply involved with. Rationalism, as discussed in this episode, is distinct from the Enlightenment-era philosophy of René Descartes. In this context, rationalism refers to a philosophy and community rooted largely in the tech-centric Bay Area, dedicated to using reason, logic, and evidence-based thinking to make better decisions aimed at improving the world. Members of this community focus primarily on thinking clearly about moral responsibility and preventing existential risks, with particular attention to the potential rise of artificial intelligence. Now, contrary to what you might expect from an online philosophical movement, this is not just a group of random anonymous users sharing opinions about whatever strikes their interest. Instead, rationalists have substantial connections to major Bay Area institutions, including some of the world's largest tech companies. There are even entire institutions devoted to this approach, such as the Center for Applied Rationality, or CFAR, which offers interactive activities and retreats for its members. Lesota, who at this time began using she/her pronouns and adopting the name Ziz, was immediately captivated. The group explored many topics that she too found deeply intriguing and much more meaningful than the routine of a typical corporate job. As time passed, Lesota, now primarily known by the nickname Ziz, found herself spending increasing amounts of time online and becoming more isolated from the outside world, whether she was working on a video game or blogging about rationalism. She was chronically unemployed, and although she applied to some more traditional jobs, at one point even landing a position in her field only to be fired within 4 days, she quickly grew disillusioned with both the job market and the very idea of having to work just to pay rent. Having moved to the Bay Area and established it as her home, she couldn't just up and leave. This was where she wanted to be, and it's where most of her connections were as well. Now, for anyone familiar with the area, calling rent expensive, little bit of an understatement. To conserve the cash she had managed to save, she began hopping between Airbnb locations each month, trying to stay in the community she had become a part of, while also starting to withdraw from the world. Now, she wasn't a complete shut-in. Around the end of 2015, she met someone named Gwen Danielson through mutual connections in the rationalist community. The two immediately clicked over a surprising number of shared traits. Both were transgender, both were dedicated vegans, and both were deeply concerned about the environment and the rise of AI. What impressed Lesotho most was that Gwen, frustrated by the area's high cost of living, had decided to opt out altogether by choosing to live full-time on a small sailboat. While they didn't realize it at the time, this seemingly innocent friendship would eventually become the foundation upon which this blood-soaked cult was built. By this stage, Ziz Lesotho had entirely isolated herself from broader society. She was moving between various Airbnbs, trying to make her remaining cash last as long as possible, surviving mostly on the occasional odd job or freelance programming gig. But rent, unfortunately, waits for no one, even for aspiring philosophers or would-be cult leaders. As her situation became increasingly precarious, Ziz decided things were dire enough to accept Gwen's offer to move onto a small boat docked at the Berkeley Marina. And when I say small, I mean small. The boat was only 24 feet long, with a cramped enclosed cabin barely spacious enough for one, let alone two. The two friends, long-time ideological allies, were able to make it work, at least at first. They spent many hours inside discussing and debating the intricacies of transness, veganism, rationalism, artificial intelligence, and their general plans to save the world. However, it wasn't long before issues would begin to surface. Danielson, who suffered from both ADHD and autism, would spend extended periods talking to herself. While most people occasionally catch themselves doing this, Danielson's case was different. She would engage in full two-way conversations with herself. Even worse, any attempt to interrupt these sessions would put Gwen in a terrible mood that could last the entire day. And space also became an issue. Ziz, accustomed to a 3-monitor setup, found it difficult to code in a cramped space with only a laptop, and the situation quickly became unsustainable. In 2017, Lesotho had moved onto her own sailboat, which she acquired for $600 and docked near Gwen's. With their two boats side by side and both owners sharing the same philosophy, the idea of a rationalist fleet naturally took shape in Ziz's mind. She envisioned a ship where fellow rationalists could live inexpensively, forming a community of like-minded people. With just their two tiny boats, however, they weren't about to stage an invasion or make a big impact. They needed to expand. Originally from Alaska, Lesotho managed to find something promising, a 94-foot-long World War II tugboat called the Caleb. It wasn't exactly a luxury cruise liner, but it was better than nothing. Their plan was to travel to Alaska, purchase the Caleb, and sail it down to the Bay Area. It's important to remember that this wasn't a typical ship, it was a tugboat. These vessels are like the cargo-hauling locomotives of the sea, built for endurance and capable of towing boats much larger than themselves, but really, really slowly. The Caleb could manage, on a good day, a speed of 10 knots per hour. In contrast, many modern vessels easily cruise at around 20 knots. While a trip of this distance would take a modern vessel about 2 weeks, it ultimately took the Caleb more than 4. But what is a captain without a crew? Clearly, some recruiting was in order. Ziz began advertising the opportunity to drive a tugboat from Alaska to the San Francisco Bay, letting everyone know that all expenses would be covered. She eventually assembled a crew of 5, Gwen, herself, Dan Powell, a Navy veteran with mechanical experience, and 2 others whose identities are kept confidential for privacy reasons. The trip got off to a good start, but quickly took a turn for the worse. From the moment they set foot on the ship, it was clear that the vessel was not in as good condition as they had believed. At first, the issue seemed mostly cosmetic, like there was lots of rust throughout the aging ship. However, shortly after setting sail, they discovered a more serious problem. The ship had a tendency to list rather dramatically to one side. The vessel was old, slow, rusty, had 1 bathroom, and to make matters worse, that single bathroom stopped working completely not long after they departed, adding to everyone's discomfort. This was hardly the voyage the crew had imagined when they signed up. Matters were made worse by the atmosphere aboard the ship, particularly due to Ziz. Although never openly hostile or threatening, there was something slightly off about her. One of the unnamed volunteers later remarked that while Lesotho's views still generally aligned with those of the rationalist community, quote, Ziz was a little on the creepy side, but well below the scary threshold. She was more confident than I thought she had the right to be, and she was abrasive about it. This contrasted with Lesotho, who was already known for being aggressive on these issues. At one point, she even blogged, "I'm proud of the number of people who have gone vegan because they are afraid of me." By the time they reached Washington State, Powell had reached his wit's end with the group. Ziz had allegedly taken it upon herself to confront him, convinced that Powell was actually transgender as well. After forcefully telling her to drop the subject, he had had enough and disembarked in Washington. He then severed all ties with Lesotho and Danielson, having lost what he claimed were tens of thousands of dollars in the project. After the long-delayed docking of the Caleb and the establishment of their base of operations in late 2017, even larger cracks began to appear between Lesotho's group and the broader rationalist movement. While rationalists emphasize self-optimization and considering the greater good, Lesotho and her followers took this philosophy to a whole different level. With the Caleb now in place and ready to welcome anyone interested in joining, the rationalist fleet was born. It was here that a distinctive Zizian philosophy and movement began to emerge. Central to this split was the belief in the moral supremacy of veganism, a principle not widely accepted within the broader rationalist community, as well as deeper philosophical and pseudoscientific ideas about moral dualism within the body. For Lesotho, eating meat was nothing short of a scandal, almost a sin, which starkly revealed the moral failings she perceived in the societies that she had once been a part of. Unable to tolerate this any longer, she formally broke away. On a more philosophical level, the group's ideas diverged sharply from their rationalist origins. Writing extensively on her blog, Sinceriously, Ziz developed a philosophy of moral dualism within the self. She believed people were divided between two cores, with most having one good and one non-good core. Sometimes a person might have two non-good cores. Ziz, however, counted herself among the fortunate few who were blessed with two good cores. Funny how that kind of luck always seems to work out in these stories, doesn't it? She came to believe that the vast majority of people ultimately gave in to their non-good core above all through compromise. Simply existing in the world required a form of compromise, going about daily life, working to pay rent, and most significantly, consuming animals were all seen as a sign of surrender to the non-good. If this perspective seems radical, it is nothing compared to the remedies they prescribed. Compromise was viewed as the gravest failure, and so it was considered better to remove yourself from society entirely than to participate and betray your values. This included one of the most common tactics among cults, cutting off friends and family who were perceived as morally corrupt or who questioned your involvement in the movement. Gwen, in particular, went on to develop a downright dangerous approach to self-improvement that involved sleep deprivation. Members of the group would attempt to mimic the unihemispheric sleep seen in animals such as dolphins. Despite living in the ocean, these mammals breathe oxygen through lungs, not gills. Although they can hold their breath for very long periods, falling asleep like other mammals would cause them to drown. To prevent this, dolphins have evolved the remarkable ability to sleep with one side of their brain at a time, keeping the other side active to preserve vital functions. This is known as unihemispheric sleep. And to be clear, the science on this is conclusive. Humans simply cannot achieve unihemispheric sleep due to biological limitations. However, the Zizians refused to let scientific fact get in their way. They were convinced that with enough determination and sleep deprivation, humans could develop the ability by resting with one eye open and concentrating exclusively on a single object. Their reasoning was that if your non-good core was on the left side, you could put that side of your brain to sleep, thereby allowing the good core to dominate. The issue here, of course, is that sleep deprivation can be immensely harmful to our bodies. We need sleep and can begin to suffer from delayed motor functions and impaired judgment after missing even part of a single night's rest, let alone several days. This kind of deprivation would impact some individuals more severely than others. One such person was a 28-year-old Polish citizen born Chris Parsek, who would later identify as Maya Parsek. At some point in 2017, Parsek became involved with the Zizians, drawn in immediately by their mutual beliefs around rationalism, transhumanism, and artificial intelligence. She soon began experimenting more deeply with their philosophies and methodologies. After a transition, Parsek became an enthusiastic adopter of the unihemispheric sleep approach. Unfortunately, this proved detrimental in her case, ultimately resulting in her suicide in early 2018. For Ziz and her followers, this was no tragedy. Parsek was not a victim of misguided self-improvement, but rather a martyr, someone who refused to compromise with the non-good within her. Despite the fatal outcome, they considered this preferable to simply giving in to the world around them. While Lesotho would later claim that unihemispheric sleep did not doom Parsek, her other writings cast this into doubt. In a post titled Parsek's Doom, she wrote that, quote, Parsek's right hemisphere had been mostly dead, and that we each went on our own journey of jailbreaking into psychopathy fully. This was hardly a convincing declaration of innocence. After a rather uneventful year spent in isolation from the outside world, aboard the Caleb, Ziz decided it was time to take action. The first target, unsurprisingly, would not be her main intellectual opponents, but instead the rationalist community. As with many cults, Ziz focused on targeting those who, in her view, should have known better. Enforcing ideological conformity within the group took precedence over battling any external enemy. As former members of several rationalist institutions, it wasn't especially difficult for them to find a suitable event to target. As luck would have it, the Center for Applied Rationality was scheduled to hold a retreat at the Westminster Woods Center in California in just a week's time. This was perfect. The plan was straightforward. They would arrive ahead of the rationalists and block access to the retreat center until the group was persuaded to adopt more of Ziz's views. While this wasn't intended to be an explicitly violent protest, it certainly wasn't going to be a hold hands and sing along sort of affair. To block the entrance effectively, they rented a box truck, a shuttle bus, and, true to their environmental values, a Toyota Prius. 4 of them, Ziz, Gwen, and 2 others named Emma Baranian and Alexander Leatham, arrived at the site dressed in long, flowing black robes and wearing Guy Fawkes masks. To say the protest did not go according to plan is a bit like saying cults are only slightly creepy. It's an understatement if there ever was one. The protesters had the dates wrong. They arrived long after the rationalist retreat had begun and were closer to the event's end than its start. Undeterred, they decided to adapt. Rather than block the rationalists from entering the grounds, they were going to stop them from leaving. While neither tactic was exactly legal, preventing someone from leaving a closed area is certainly a step up on the police get involved scale compared to simply blocking an entrance. To make matters worse, the rationalists weren't the only group at the retreat center that day. Apparently unknown to the Zizians, a children's group was using the shared ropes course, and the blockade trapped all 24 young children inside the compound as well. While undoubtedly terrifying for those being held against their will, the scene is almost comedic in hindsight. Dressed as if they had just stepped out of V for Vendetta, the group completely misunderstood their timeline and had no idea they would end up trapping a children's group. Panic quickly spread among the counselors as one of them called the police after claiming to see one of the Zizians with a gun. What was originally intended as a protest to block the start of a retreat quickly escalated into a Columbine-esque situation with the police in full not screwing around mode. The response was swift and overwhelming. Multiple SWAT teams arrived on the scene, accompanied by several armored vehicles and even a helicopter. The children were evacuated from the retreat center and sheltered in bulletproof vehicles. The Zizians were immediately arrested on charges of felony child endangerment and false imprisonment, among other offenses. However, they quickly posted bail and soon had their charges reduced to misdemeanors. By this point, things were not going well for the Zizians at all. Their attempt to protest the rationalist retreat had ended in complete disaster, accomplishing little more than frightening a group of schoolchildren. Publicity surrounding child endangerment rarely attracts new supporters, which meant the crew of the Caleb were now more isolated than ever. To make matters worse, the boat itself was in terrible condition, leaking increasing amounts of oil into the harbour. The group was struggling just to keep the vessel afloat. Serious repairs were just out of the question. Eventually, the problem became so severe that the Coast Guard declared the boat an imminent threat to public health and ordered the nearly 3,000 gallons of diesel fuel on board to be removed. Despite their supposed commitment to environmentalism, the group ignored this order completely, leading to significant fines for harbour cleanup. By March 2020, the Caleb had reached a point of no return. Unable to continue caring for the vessel, its caretakers decided to anchor it at the harbour's work dock and simply abandoned the ship. With no one stepping forward to claim ownership, the abandoned vessel began to take on water and eventually sank in the outer parts of the harbour, coming to rest semi-submerged due to the area's shallow bottom. To this day, the 345-ton heap of rusting metal remains at the entrance to Half Moon Bay, with removal estimates reaching around $2 million. Whether the irony ever dawned on the Zizians, a radical environmentalist group, that they had created a multi-million-dollar environmental disaster and walked away from any responsibility for it, well, that remains unclear. Yet all was not lost for the group. While struggling with the Caleb, they had befriended Curtis Lind, a kind older man who visited the harbour often. A retired arts enthusiast and devoted animal lover, Curtis wanted to use some of his accumulated savings to give back by providing affordable living space for artists and others, offering residences at below-market rates. Ziz was quick to accept the offer, moving into Lind's property in early 2020 with a small group of dedicated followers. They initially set up a camp in box trucks and at first enjoyed a positive relationship with Lind. However, tensions soon began to surface, with disagreements over rent being the most significant issue. It's important to remember, that all of this took place at the height of the COVID pandemic in 2020. California, along with many other states, had enacted a total moratorium on evictions, aiming to prevent people whose jobs were impacted by the virus from losing their homes. While the policy was well-intentioned, it effectively made rent optional for many people. The Zizians quickly realized this, and it wasn't long before they stopped paying rent, knowing that Lind had little recourse. He found himself simply stuck with them. Emboldened by these developments, and for the first time in a long while starting to attract new recruits, the group began to expand beyond their original box trucks. They started moving into trailers originally intended for other guests Lind had invited to the property. What this group did all day was never entirely clear. They didn't hold traditional jobs, and they brought with them a significant amount of technology. Several members were seen wandering around completely naked, sometimes talking to themselves. Although Lind had been a peaceful man his whole life, he began to feel afraid. He was powerless over these people who were now on his land, and it became increasingly apparent that they were not there to make friends. Towards the end of 2020, he applied for a firearms permit and bought a handgun, which he found himself carrying more and more often for personal protection in case things took a turn for the worse. Despite his best efforts, Lind remained unable to remove the Zizians for years. This ongoing standoff culminated in 2022 when the eviction moratorium was finally lifted. Around that same time, however, a member of the cult called in an emergency boat from off the coast. Ziz had fallen in the water and hadn't been seen or heard from since. Had she drowned? Had she swum to a remote shore and become trapped? The Coast Guard was called in, and what started as a search and rescue mission eventually became a recovery operation for a body. Despite their efforts, the searches all turned up empty. No body was found. Ziz was simply gone. After nearly 2 days of non-stop searching, the Coast Guard called off the mission. Lesotho, presumed dead, had an obituary published in her hometown newspaper. The reported cause of death? A boating accident. You can only imagine the group's reaction once the eviction moratorium was lifted and Lind demanded the more than $60,000 in back rent that they owed. And there was no way they could come close to paying that amount. Leaderless and facing the loss of their only base of operations, the group decided that action had to be taken. The plan was set. They lured Lind onto the property under the guise of a maintenance issue. Shortly after he arrived, Alexander Leatham, Emma Boranian, and another accomplice surrounded him, with Leatham leading the assault wielding a samurai sword. According to Lind's testimony, he looked down to see the sword piercing through him. Boranian then joined the attack, stabbing him with a knife. It was a complete ambush. Lind was being stabbed by multiple assailants from several directions. Blades slashed through his back, across his stomach, and even over his eye. What his attackers didn't know was that Lind was armed that day. In a desperate bid to save his life, he pulled out his pistol, raised it, and fatally shot Boranian. He also fired at another attacker who survived the shooting before fleeing the scene, bleeding heavily and on the brink of death. Despite being stabbed more than 50 times, including multiple wounds from the sword, Lind miraculously survived the ordeal, though he lost his right eye and was deeply traumatized by the experience. Nevertheless, he never lost his love for nature or animals, and after making a nearly full recovery, continued to do what he loved most. At this stage, the Zizians were entering the final phase of the cult, freefall. Although they may have believed they were still fighting for their original cause, this was merely a delusion. The movement had by now almost entirely abandoned its ideological roots in environmentalism. Instead, it had rapidly devolved into acts of self-preservation and ruthless retaliation against anyone who became an inconvenience. They used the language and structures of their once philosophical movement to rationalize any action they took. In their eyes, they were the good guys. Just ask them, and they'd assure you of it. And if you didn't agree, that simply made you an enemy. If you've ever read about some of history's most violent movements, this mentality likely sounds like a familiar warning. Throughout the centuries, people have used such thinking to justify all manner of atrocities. But sadly, the Zizians would soon be counted among them. On New Year's Eve, 2022, Rita and Richard Zyko spent the evening at home. Having retired years earlier to a well-off, quiet neighborhood outside Philadelphia, the couple planned to spend the holiday time together in their house. That plan was shattered when they were brutally murdered in their own home that night. Because they lived alone, it wasn't until several days later that a police officer conducting a wellness check discovered their bodies. Both had been shot in the head, Rita from behind, Richard from the side. Soon after, their only daughter Michelle was brought in for questioning by the police in her hometown in Vermont. Coincidentally, Michelle was set to inherit her parents' estate as their sole child. Moreover, she owned a firearm that fired the same caliber bullets that were found at the crime scene and had purchased ammunition made by the same manufacturer. Naturally, they applied and were granted a search warrant, and at this point, Zyko was in Pennsylvania for a parent's funeral. There, Pennsylvania state troopers obtained a separate warrant and stormed the Candlewood Suites Hotel in search of her. After breaking down the door, the state troopers didn't find a gun. What they did find was even more bizarre. Jack, Ziz Lesota, was alive and breathing, despite her attempts to play dead to avoid detection. The scene was completely absurd. The state troopers quickly realized that Ziz was alive, but they couldn't get her to cooperate. Whenever they tried to move her, Ziz would go limp and remain that way for hours. An officer even had to prop her head up for the mugshot. Both Zyko and Ziz were taken into custody, although they were ultimately released due to insufficient evidence linking them to the murder at the time. After almost 2 years of lying low, the Zizians found themselves back in the news in early 2025. On January the 20th, Border Patrol agent David Milland pulled over a blue Toyota Prius during a routine traffic stop. Inside the car were Teresa Youngblood and Felix Bauchelt, who also went by the name of Ophelia, both members of the Zizians, both with strong academic backgrounds. Bauchelt, in particular, is a fascinating figure. Once earning over $500,000 a year on Wall Street at the age of 26, he left that lucrative life behind to join the group. The traffic stop was not entirely random, though. The two had been under surveillance for some time after they began exhibiting strange behavior in public, such as wearing tactical gear, including military-grade gas masks, and openly carrying firearms. Again, Agent Malland was the first officer on the scene, but within moments, 2 more squad cars arrived as backup. Inside the car, officers discovered large amounts of tactical gear, which the Zizians knew would likely lead to serious charges if they were caught. While some details of what happens next remain speculative, it is believed that the pair felt they needed to act quickly before even more law enforcement arrived. About 15 minutes into the stop, a gunshot rang out, and then another, and another. Agent Milland was caught completely off guard when one of the individuals in the stopped vehicle fatally shot him. The other 2 officers, already on the scene, quickly returned fire. Both the driver and passenger were shot. Youngblood survived, but Bauchelt was killed in the exchange. This should be seen as nothing less than the cult exerting its last desperate gasp of violence against anyone who stood in their way or had previously wronged them. However, their actions were becoming increasingly careless. Not only was this yet another instance of the Zizians being linked to violence, but the weapons used in the attack on the Border Patrol agents were registered to none other than Michelle Zyko. She was soon arrested, along with Ziz, who, despite their encounters with law enforcement in 2023, had continued living together. Both were charged with firearms possession as well as with obstructing and hindering investigations. The Zizians had made it clear that anyone who stood in their way was considered a threat that needed to be eliminated. Unfortunately, their killing spree was far from over. The trial against Zizian members for the assault on Curtis Lind was set to begin in just a few weeks. Prosecution argued that since Lind had been forced to defend himself, the Zizians were responsible for the deaths of Emma Berhanian. The only witness, Lind himself, now 82 years old. One cold January evening, Maximilian Snyder, partner to none other than Teresa Youngblood and a card-carrying Zizian, crept up to Lind's house under the cover of darkness and hid out of sight. When Lind stepped outside, Snyder pounced. Lind never saw the attack coming and stood no chance. Snyder slit his throat, leaving him to bleed out on the scene. Both Youngblood and Snyder, despite their bright and promising academic backgrounds, now sat in jail, facing murder charges. Now, this group offers a unique example of how even otherwise successful individuals can become radicalized. Often those who get drawn into cults have experienced significant suffering and become alienated from society, which can lead to their radicalization. While this may be true for some of the Zizians, such as Lesota, who struggled to keep a job and was fired within 4 days, many others had a very different background, enjoying high salaries at prestigious companies or attending some of the world's top universities. Take Maximilian Snyder, for example. He was studying computer science at Oxford, one of the world's most celebrated institutions. Despite his academic success, Snyder was socially isolated and quickly became involved in the Zizian movement after forming a relationship with Teresa Youngblood, who he met before university at the prestigious Lakeside School in his home state of Washington. The 2 had applied for a marriage license in November 2024, just a few months before the killing spree. Originally united by a seemingly genuine concern for the future on issues ranging from the environment to artificial intelligence, the group grew increasingly radicalized. They came to believe that their own moral superiority justified almost any action, even when those actions ran completely contrary to their original mission. As a result, 6 people are now dead, victims of a tragic sequence of suicides and murders. What began as protests against those labelled as ideological enemies deteriorated into brutal violence. The murder of an 82-year-old man over past rent disputes, and the killing of a retired couple who had been living a quiet, peaceful life. Not to mention the trauma inflicted on children at the retreat center who had to be evacuated in armored vehicles. And all of this for what? Despite their violence, the group made no progress on any of their core concerns. Their most significant impact, apart from the loss suffered by victims' families, was the multi-million-dollar environmental disaster that was left behind, the semi-submerged Caleb still looming in Half Moon Bay as a testament to the group's recklessness. Thank you for watching.